Welcome to Sleeping History. Tonight we're travelling back to Victorian England, not to the ballrooms or the grand estates, but to the crowded streets and chilly, everyday world most people actually lived in. Let me know in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it for you? Now, let's step into the fog. You wake before dawn in a cramped, narrow room that barely fits the straw mattress you share with a sibling or two. A faint chill creeps under your wool blanket, the kind that lingers deep in your bones. The city outside is quiet for now, but already you can hear the distant thrum of carts over cobblestones and the soft hacking cough of your father from the next room. You press your hand to the window, and it fogs immediately with your breath. Outside, London is shrouded in a dense yellow mist that settles low in the streets, heavy with soot and the promise of rain. Getting up is an act of will. The cold floorboards bite at your bare feet, and you fumble for your stockings, still slightly damp from drying by the fire. If you're lucky, you have a second pair, but for most there's only one set, worn threadbare from endless days of trudging through puddles and mud. You pull on your shirt, your trousers, or petticoat, perhaps your only dress, patched and mended so often the original fabric is almost gone. Every piece of clothing tells a story, a tear sewn up by your mother's aching hands, a patch of different cloth from a neighbour's cast-off, a button borrowed from a forgotten coat. There is no privacy, not in a home this crowded. Your siblings turn and mumble in their sleep as you dress, and your mother is already up, her back hunched as she stirs the porridge pot. If there's any coal left, she'll stoke the fire, but most mornings it's just the dull grey heat of yesterday's ashes. The air inside is thick, part smoke, part damp, part the lingering scent of last night's cabbage boiled with onions. You hope today the rain will hold off, but hope is a fragile thing in a city where the sky is almost always grey. As you prepare to leave, you wrap yourself in a shawl, perhaps your father's old coat, the sleeves trailing past your hands. Your shoes, if you have them, are heavy with patches and lined with bits of newspaper. The soles are thin, but you pull them on anyway. Every family has their tricks: an extra sock, a piece of leather glued inside, straw stuffed in the toes for warmth. The street outside is already waking. Vendors push carts of bread, fruit and fish through the haze, their voices muffled by scarves. Chimney sweeps, some as young as you, gather in ragged clusters, faces already smudged black before the sun has fully risen. Horses clop past, hooves striking sparks from the cobblestones, carriages sending up sprays of cold, filthy water as they turn a corner too sharply. You pick your way between puddles, avoiding the worst of the muck, though it's impossible to stay dry for long. The gutters are full of water, of rubbish, of worse. Rats dart between piles of refuse, and stray dogs bark at one another over scraps. The fog is so thick today that you can't see the end of your street. It swirls around your knees and clings to your eyelashes. Some days the sun never truly rises, just a brighter patch of grey in an endless sea of shadows. Street lamps glow dim and yellow, their glass panes streaked with the soot of countless coal fires. In the richer parts of the city, the lamps stand in neat rows, watched over by uniformed boys with long-handled matches. Here, though, half the lamps are broken, and those that work are soon swallowed up by the smog. You hurry past beggars huddled in doorways, their hands outstretched, and past the market stalls where sellers shout over one another, voices hoarse from the cold. The baker's boy wheels his cart through the sludge, the scent of fresh bread barely masking the sour reek of spoiled meat and offal from the butcher's yard nearby. If you have a penny, you might buy a crust. Otherwise you walk quickly, hands deep in your pockets, head bowed against the wind. The world is noisy, even in the fog. Wheels clatter, dogs bark, a mother calls for her child, a policeman's whistle pierces the gloom. Children run barefoot down alleys, their laughter sharp and quick as they dart away from the truant officer or a shopkeeper's angry shout. Sometimes you join them, hopping over puddles, feet already wet and cold, but more often you walk quickly, focused on your destination, the school, the workshop, the laundry, or wherever your day's labor begins. If you are a child, school may be a brief respite, but even here the cold follows you. The room is crowded and poorly heated. Ink freezes in its bottle, and breath hangs in clouds above bowed heads as you practice your letters. The master paces the aisles, ruler in hand, and every cough or sneeze earns a glare. For many, school is a luxury, a place to escape for a few hours from the endless chores of home, or the watchful eyes of employers. But even here, your shoes never quite dry, and your fingers ache with cold as you write. If you work, the weather shapes everything. Laundry is hung in icy courtyards, stiffening before it dries. Milkmen and fishwives cool their wares until their throats are raw. A delivery boy pedals his cart, coat buttoned up to his chin, fingers numb on the handlebars. For the poor, work does not stop for the weather. Hunger and need are stronger than rain or cold. A day lost to sickness means less food, less coal, less hope. The streets themselves are another trial. Cobblestones are uneven, cracked from years of wear. Every dip is a puddle, every gutter a stream of filth and refuse. When it rains, the water pools in low places, mixing with ash from the factories, dung from horses, and the runoff from butchers' shops and tanneries. Your shoes, no matter how sturdy, cannot keep this out. Every step is a risk, a turned ankle, a slip that sends you sprawling, clothes soaked and stained, hands scraped raw. You pass the workhouses and charity hospitals, their doors crowded with the desperate. The sick and the old cluster near the entrances, seeking a bit of warmth, or a scrap of bread. The world is indifferent to their need, and so are most passers-by. You learn early not to meet their gaze, not to let your heart linger on their plight, for tomorrow it might be you on that step. Weather is not just cold or rain, it is a force that shapes every aspect of life. In summer the city swelters, the air thick with flies, and the stench of rotting garbage. In winter the fog and frost turn every morning into a trial. Spring brings hope, but also floods, as the river rises and low-lying streets fill with water. Autumn is brief, a fleeting time of clear air and weak sunshine before the fog returns. Illness follows the weather. Coughs and fevers spread quickly, especially in crowded tenements. Tuberculosis, called consumption, claims young and old alike, the constant dampness feeding the disease. Doctors are expensive, and most people rely on home remedies, herbs, hot bricks, mustard plasters. Every family has their secrets, passed down through generations, for soothing a cough or bringing down a fever. Sometimes they work, sometimes not. Despite it all, life continues. You grow used to the cold, to the grey, to the endless sound and movement of the city. You learn to appreciate small comforts, a cup of tea, a fire burning hot enough to warm your toes, a new patch on your coat that keeps out the wind. Laughter is rare but cherished, a joke shared in the market, a story told by the hearth, the brief warmth of the sun breaking through the clouds, all become treasures in a life shaped by struggle. The day passes in a slow parade of challenges. Meals are quick, often eaten standing up or walking. Lunch might be bread and cheese, a potato baked in the ashes, a bit of cold meat if you are lucky. Water is fetched from a pump in the street, heavy buckets carried up flights of stairs, every drop a small victory. In the evening, you gather with family, crowding close to the fire. The air is thick with smoke, the windows fogged, the world outside held at bay for a few precious hours. As night falls, the city quiets but does not sleep. The lamps glow dimly, their light barely cutting through the mist. The street is never truly silent. There are always footsteps, distant laughter, the cry of a baby, the lowing of a cow being led to slaughter in the market at dawn. You wrap yourself tighter in your blanket and listen to the city breathe around you, a living, restless thing. In the darkness, you dream of warmth and sun, of clean streets and soft beds. You wonder if tomorrow will be easier, if the weather will break, if the world will ever feel kind. But for now, you are here, part of the endless quiet struggle that is daily life in Victorian England. And as the city sighs beneath the weight of its own history, you drift to sleep, tired, cold and hopeful, in your own small way, for the promise of another day. The cold of Victorian England did not let go, even as the day unfolded. The sunlight crept across the rooftops. The mist that lingered in the alleyways only seemed to settle deeper, weaving itself into every inch of the city's fabric. If you lived here, you became attuned to this quiet, endless struggle against the weather and the streets. You learned to move through it not just with your body, but with your heart, carrying hope, worry, and a peculiar kind of patience that only hardship could teach. By midday, the city was alive and noisy, yet the cold never truly left. Even in the largest crowds, there was a sense of isolation, a barrier formed by scarves, hats, and hunched shoulders. Everyone focused on their own journey through the chill. Shopkeepers stood in doorways, stamping their feet to stay warm, their breath fogging in the air as they called out prices for vegetables, bread or old boots. Street sweepers, usually boys or old men, worked steadily, their brooms sending up clouds of dirty water as they tried in vain to clear the endless tide of filth that flowed down every gutter. If you were one of these workers, the task felt eternal. There was always another patch of muck to sweep, another pile of horse dung to clear before the next carriage rolled through. The city rewarded you with blisters and backaches, the promise of a few pence and the knowledge that tomorrow would bring the same. On days of heavy rain, your work was nearly pointless. The water washed everything downriver, but left the stones slick and dangerous, every step a risk of slipping. Children found games even in these conditions. Skipping ropes slapped the wet stones, marbles rolled through puddles, and chalk drawings faded before midday. Laughter could be heard, quick and bright, but it was always tinged with caution. One eye on the lamplighter's approach, another on the truant officer who might send you back to work or school. For the youngest, the street was both playground and danger zone. They learned to dart between carts, to beg a halfpenny from the baker, or to follow their mothers through the market, baskets swinging from chilled arms. Inside, the battle continued. Homes filled with the scent of boiling laundry, the hiss of a kettle on the stove, the sharp tang of coal and wood smoke that clung to everything. Mothers worked all day to keep the cold at bay, scrubbing, mending, patching, and urging children not to dawdle near the open door. Laundry was hung across the room, draping every available surface. It dried slowly, if at all, and left the air heavy and damp. Meals were simple and hard-won. A pot of stew simmered on the hearth, filled with whatever scraps could be spared. A carrot, a bit of cabbage, a bone saved from yesterday's supper. Bread was precious. You stretched it with potatoes or beans. If you were lucky, a neighbor brought a bit of bacon, or an uncle found work and shared his wages. Hunger was an undercurrent, present even in times of plenty. Children were taught early not to ask for more, to leave the last bit for someone smaller, to swallow their disappointment and fill their bellies with hot tea when food was scarce. Water, too, was a struggle. It was fetched from a public pump, or if you were fortunate, a spigot in the yard, each trip a heavy cold journey that left your hands red and raw. The water was rarely clean, and every family knew the signs of trouble: a strange taste, a sudden illness, the dreadful worry of cholera or the fever spreading through the street. Boiling water was best, but fuel was costly and time short. So you took your chances, prayed for luck, and hoped your children would stay healthy through another season. The city itself was alive with sounds: horse hooves on stone, bells from distant churches, the clatter of dishes in a pub, the shouts of vendors, and the constant background hum of countless people going about their lives. But beneath it all, there was a thread of worry: a father late home from work, a neighbor coughing in the next room, a rumor of sickness, or another round of layoffs at the factory. Worry settled into the bones, as persistent as the cold, as much a part of life as bread or tea. Still, life carried on. Children trudged to school, their slates and books protected in oilcloth wraps. Girls practiced their letters with frozen fingers. Boys fidgeted in their seats waiting for the bell to ring. Teachers were stern, the rooms crowded and loud, but education offered a glimmer of hope, maybe a better job, a way out of the endless grind, the dream of a future where warmth and comfort were not so rare. Adults, too, found their escapes. A neighbor's visit, a shared loaf of bread, a laugh in the face of misfortune all became lifelines, moments of light in the grey. Women gathered at the laundry to share gossip and advice, their hands red from scrubbing, their voices rising above the steam. Men found a few minutes at the pub or beside a stove, swapping stories and worries, finding comfort in the company of those who understood. The rituals of weather and street shaped the calendar, as well as the day. Spring brought the promise of cleaner air and longer light, but also floods and sudden chills. Summer was short, a brief burst of green and warmth, a time to open windows and dream of better days. Autumn brought damp and fog, the beginning of a long descent into winter's darkness. Each season demanded new routines, new kinds of endurance, new hope. Evenings were quiet but busy. There was always more to do: socks to mend, shirts to wash, boots to dry by the fire. The fire itself was a comfort and a challenge, its warmth never quite enough for everyone. Children huddled together on the floor, mothers stirred the pot or soothed a crying baby. Fathers scraped mud from their boots and counted the coins left for the week. Stories were told, sometimes of happier times, sometimes of survival, always colored by the hardships of the day. Illness was a constant threat. A cough that lingered, a fever that would not break, the slow decline of a neighbor whose strength faded each day. Remedies were tried and shared: onion poultices, hot bricks wrapped in towels, honey for sore throats. Prayers were whispered at night, for health, for warmth, for another day together. The fear of the workhouse, of separation, of loss, haunted every home. Yet, in the face of so much difficulty, there was resilience. Children learned to find joy in the smallest pleasures: a game of marbles, a patch of sunlight on the floor, a rare treat from a parent's hand. Adults drew strength from each other, from the routines that filled their days, from the knowledge that survival itself was a kind of victory. You might be cold, tired, hungry, but you were alive, and tomorrow the city would wake again. Night fell early, especially in winter. The city shrank to the glow of a few lamps, the warmth of a single fire. The streets grew quiet, but never silent. There was always a cart rattling past, a distant shout, the rustle of rats in the walls. Inside, families drew close, wrapping themselves in what comfort they could find. Sleep came slowly, sometimes fitful, sometimes deep with exhaustion. Dreams were of warmth and plenty, of sun and open fields, of a life not bounded by cold and struggle. But even in dreams, the city was never far away. You woke to the same chill, the same fog, the same long day ahead, but you also woke to the same family, the same routines, the same stubborn hope that kept you moving forward, one step at a time. And so, day after day, night after night, the people of Victorian England endured, through weather and hardship, through the noise and filth of the streets, through illness and worry. They found ways to survive, to laugh, to love, and to dream. Their story was not one of grand adventures, but of countless small acts of courage, of ordinary people facing extraordinary challenges with quiet strength. As another day faded into darkness, you wrapped yourself in your threadbare blanket, listening to the city outside, and knew that you would face tomorrow as you had today, with patience, with care, and with the hope that someday things might be just a little bit better. The weather and the streets might have set the stage, but for most people in Victorian England, the greatest source of exhaustion was the day's work. It waited for you, every single morning, merciless, monotonous, and rarely ever ending, no matter your age, your strength, or your dreams. In Victorian times, the lines between childhood, adulthood, and old age were often blurred by necessity, because as soon as you were able, you worked. For many families, the day began in darkness. The clock on the mantel, if your home was lucky enough to have one, might not yet read 6, but already feet shuffled on cold floors. Mothers and fathers woke before dawn, rubbing sore muscles, lighting the first fire, preparing a meager breakfast of porridge or tea, while the youngest children slept a few minutes longer in beds that never felt quite warm. In households with more mouths than beds, sleep was often broken and restless. There was no luxury of sleeping in, no matter how tired you felt. The city itself demanded your energy, your attention, your presence. If you were a child in the poorer districts, your work might start as early as age 5 or 6. For boys, jobs included running messages, sweeping factory floors, selling newspapers, or for the unlucky, descending into chimneys as a sweep. Chimney sweeps, some barely tall enough to reach the next rung on the ladder, crawled through dark soot-choked shafts, scraping brick with bare hands, their skin raw, lungs burning, and knees bruised from the climb. Accidents were common, and more than one child never made it back out into the daylight. Girls worked too, though their jobs often hid indoors. Many sewed buttons and made matches in cramped, poorly lit rooms. Others spent their days as nursemaids, carrying babies from house to house, their own arms and backs growing strong long before their time. The luckier ones might find work at a dressmaker's, or as a flower seller, but the hours were long, and the pay, in pennies, stretched just enough to buy a crust and a few shreds of dignity. Factory work was a new kind of monster, a vast humming world of gears and pulleys, steam and sweat. Textile mills employed whole families, who arrived together just after dawn, and worked side by side for 12, 14, even 16 hours at a time. The air inside the mill was thick and hot, filled with the constant whirring and banging of looms. Fluffy clouds of cotton dust sparkled in shafts of sun, but soon coated hair, skin and lungs. Breathing became difficult, voices hoarse, eyes and noses itching constantly. By midday, everyone was tired, but breaks were short and strictly timed. Even a moment's rest might mean the overseer's sharp rebuke, or worse, the threat of being sacked. In the mines things were darker still. Boys called trappers worked in silence and blackness, opening and closing heavy doors to control the flow of air, their only light a flickering candle stuck in a lump of clay. Others hauled coal carts through narrow tunnels, their backs bent, hands call used, muscles straining with each load. The earth was always cold and damp. The risk of collapse or flood was never far from anyone's mind. Adults worked side by side with children in almost every job. Men toiled in the docks, loading and unloading crates from distant lands, their backs and shoulders aching under the weight of barrels and bales. They built the railways that stretched out from the city, hammered nails, mixed mortar, pushed wheelbarrows along rickety planks, all in the hope of a day's pay. If they were strong and lucky, they might hold a job for years. If not, a single injury could leave them begging, or worse, in the workhouse. For women, work never stopped, even if she did not leave home for a wage. A mother might rise before dawn and collapse long after sunset. She swept, cooked, scrubbed, patched, soothed, taught, and comforted. Her own rest found only in the rare silence after everyone else was asleep. Many took in laundry or mending, their hands red from lye and soap, fingers pricked by needles, eyes tired from squinting in the dim light. Those who went into service, working as maids, cooks or nannies in the houses of the wealthy, faced their own endless routines. Maids often woke before the family, lighting fires, carrying hot water up countless flights of stairs, dusting and preparing breakfast. The mistress of the house might have high standards, and the threat of dismissal was always close at hand. A servant's bed was often a hard pallet in a chilly attic or cellar, and sleep was interrupted by the ring of a bell or the sound of footsteps in the hallway. A day's work was not just physically demanding, but emotionally draining. Each task came with rules and expectations. Children learned quickly that a mistake meant punishment, embarrassment, or for some, the loss of a precious job. Adults bore the worry of job security, knowing that an accident or illness might leave the family destitute. Wages were often paid in arrears or cut without warning. Many workers lived in constant fear, not just of hunger or cold, but of falling behind, of being seen as lazy or ungrateful, of losing their place in the pecking order. And yet work was more than just hardship. It was the thread that tied the city together. At shift change, the streets filled with a river of tired bodies, faces grimy but determined. Children ran ahead, women compared notes on prices and prospects, and men lingered for a pint or a pipe, swapping stories, sharing rumors, or just sitting quietly together, finding a little peace in the company of those who understood. In this world, every meal, every patch on a sleeve, every candle burning at dusk was paid for by someone's labor. The city moved on sweat, and the hope that tomorrow's work would be a little easier, a little better paid, a little less uncertain. For most, that hope was rarely realized, but it never entirely disappeared. As the sky darkened and lamps flickered to life, workers made their way home through the familiar maze of streets, boots scraping stone, shoulders heavy, dreams simple and small. The cycle of work, exhaustion, rest and hope turned as steady as the city's great clock. In the privacy of their own rooms, families shared bread and stories, patched clothes, counted pennies, and prepared for another long day. In Victorian England, to live was to work, and to work was to endure. When the day's work finally ended in Victorian England, it wasn't with a triumphant bell or a sense of real freedom. For most people, the walk home was slow and heavy, boots dragging along familiar, battered streets. The city's energy shifted as the factory whistles faded, the shop doors slammed shut, and servants rushed to finish the last of their chores before the household's evening began. You'd see the same crowds, faces grey with soot and tiredness, heading home in the fog or drizzle. Young boys, still dusted with coal or spinning mill fluff, clustered together on corners. Men limped or walked stiffly, hands rough, backs aching. Women hurried along, baskets heavy with the day's leftovers, or a bundle of mending to finish by candlelight. Sometimes there was talk, but often only silence, the deep wordless fatigue that settled over families and neighbors alike. For those returning to tiny rooms in the city's crowded districts, there was little in the way of privacy or comfort. A family might squeeze into a single room, each person finding a space on the bed, the floor, or a pile of old blankets. Boots and coats were set by the hearth, and everyone crowded close, seeking warmth from the fire if coal or wood was to be had that day. The youngest children might nod off first, lulled by the voices of siblings, the soft rattle of rain on glass, and the low crackle of flames. Evening meals were usually simple: a pot of stew, bread and dripping, potatoes boiled with a bone for flavor, a cup of weak tea. Meat was rare, fruit a luxury, and vegetables plain. There was a quiet etiquette to the meal, each person careful not to take more than their share. Adults went without so children could eat. Older siblings let the younger ones have the softest piece of bread, or a second spoonful of broth. After supper, the work wasn't over. Water had to be fetched for washing, dishes scrubbed, floors swept and laundry tended. If you were a woman, you might sit by the fire with a basket of shirts and socks to mend, fingers pricked and eyes straining in the flickering light. Children helped as they could, folding, fetching, minding little ones, or practicing letters on a slate if a school book had been borrowed. Men too took to small repairs, patching boots, sharpening a knife, or carving a toy for a restless child. But as the night wore on, the exhaustion of the day made itself felt. Muscles ached, joints stiffened, and sometimes the only thing that kept you moving was habit, a rhythm so deep in the body it seemed to come from the bones. For many there was no time or energy for leisure. The idea of reading, music, or conversation belonged to those with softer lives, more money, or simply better luck. Still, in those hours after work, small comforts became treasures. A story told by the fire, the hush as someone poured a cup of tea, the laughter that bubbled up, quick and surprising, when a child remembered something silly from school. There was a gentle pride in these routines, a sense that no matter how worn or poor, a family could create its own world inside four walls, a world of patience and endurance, if not plenty. Some evenings, mothers or fathers would step outside for a moment of quiet, leaning against the doorway, eyes scanning the fog-bound street. They might chat with a neighbor, trade news, or simply watch the city settle. For those who could scrape together a few coins, a trip to the pub offered a bit of music, a shared pint, and a break from the burdens of the day. Songs rose in the smoky air, stories flowed, and for an hour or two, even the poorest worker could feel the warmth of belonging. The toll of labor, however, was not only physical. Many found their minds drifting through the same worries every night. Would there be work tomorrow? Would the rent be paid? Was the cough in the baby's chest getting worse? Anxiety wore at the spirit as surely as cold wore at the hands and feet. Dreams were often troubled, haunted by the memory of accidents, the faces of lost friends, or the fear of ending up in the workhouse. Children, though, could be resilient. Even after the hardest days, their games and laughter brought a brightness to cramped rooms. They learned to help, to carry burdens early, but also to find joy in small things. A button for a marble, a patch of sunlight, the taste of jam saved for a birthday. Adults watched them, hoping that education, luck or change might offer a different future, a chance to escape the endless cycle of fatigue. As midnight neared, the city's pulse slowed, the fire burned low, the streets outside faded to silence, except for the distant wheels of a carriage or the soft cry of a newborn. Families drifted to sleep, huddled close for warmth, sharing blankets and dreams. Sleep was not always deep or restful, but it was a refuge, the only true escape from worry, hunger, and work. Sometimes in the quiet darkness, a mother or father would rise to check on a sick child, or to listen for the snore of an absent son or husband still at work. They stared into the fire's glow, thinking of what tomorrow might bring, and whether another day's labor would finally bring a bit of ease. But no matter how heavy the worries, morning always came. The same city, the same street, the same long day of work waiting outside the door. And so it continued, day after day, year after year. People carried their exhaustion, their hope, and their stubborn persistence into whatever the new day demanded. In this world, rest was never truly complete, but the simple act of making it through another day, of eating together, of caring for each other, of finding even the smallest bit of comfort, was a quiet triumph. And for many, that was enough to keep going, step by step, into the grey, busy, unending heart of Victorian England. You have made it through the city's fog, and the day's work. But another, quieter battle waits inside every home, behind every heavy door and thin wall. The fight for health. In Victorian England, illness was a constant companion. It crept through alleyways on the breath of fog, hid in water jugs and crowded rooms, and made no distinction between rich and poor. Yet for the poor, sickness was always closer, always more dangerous, and always harder to treat. It begins with a cough, a sound so common in the city's air that it almost fades into background noise. At first, it is a tickle in the throat, then a rattle in the chest, and soon, it is a presence in every conversation, every moment of stillness. Children cough in their sleep, mothers muffle their mouths with handkerchiefs, fathers clear their throats as they rise for another day of work. Sometimes it is just a cold, but often it is something worse. Bronchitis, pneumonia, or the slow wasting sickness that everyone fears, consumption. Tuberculosis, consumption, is everywhere. It passes from person to person in crowded homes, in schools, in churches, on the breath of strangers and loved ones alike. Its symptoms come slowly: night sweats, thinness, a cough that never truly leaves. There is no cure, only a list of remedies passed from one generation to the next. Rest, fresh air, if you can find it, cod liver oil, a change of scenery, if you have money to travel. For the poor, there is no change of air, no hope of escape, just more damp, more cold, more worry as a loved one fades before your eyes. But consumption is only one danger among many. Measles, scarlet fever, diphtheria, smallpox, each one sweeps through the city in waves, taking the youngest and weakest first. When word spreads that a child on your street is ill, fear settles like another layer of fog. Mothers keep children close, fathers pray for luck, but sickness is hard to avoid. When water is drawn from a common pump, when privies overflow in the rain, when every meal is shared with neighbors or strangers. Medical care is a luxury few can afford. Doctors are expensive, their visits reserved for the worst cases, when a child's fever will not break, or a wound will not close. More often, families rely on home remedies, and the wisdom of grandmothers. A mustard plaster for a cough, an onion poultice for a chest cold, honey for a sore throat, a piece of bread soaked in milk for a toothache. Some remedies help, others do nothing. Still, they are tried, again and again, because hope is as necessary as bread. Charity hospitals exist, but their doors are crowded with the desperate, a woman with a dying child, a man with a mangled hand from the mill, a girl with a rash that spreads across her skin. Nurses, overworked and underpaid, move from bed to bed, doing their best with what little they have. Carbolic acid to clean wounds, brandy for pain, quinine for fever. For every patient who recovers, another slips away. The work is endless, the suffering visible in every face. Sanitation is an everyday battle. Water is fetched in buckets, and no one is ever certain it is clean. Boiling helps, but fuel is costly. Outbreaks of cholera and typhoid come and go, leaving behind empty beds and new gravestones. The city tries to keep up. New sewers are dug, street cleaners work overtime, public health officials make rounds. But for many families, the efforts come too late. In the home, illness rearranges every routine. A sick child means sleepless nights, missed work, a loss of wages that can never be replaced. Mothers sit up all night with a feverish baby in their arms, wiping sweat from a hot brow, whispering lullabies and prayers. Children watch parents grow pale and thin, learn to run errands alone, to carry soup to a neighbor, to be brave in the face of worry. The presence of sickness is as much a part of family life as laughter or love, an invisible thread that binds everyone together, for better or for worse. Doctors, when they do arrive, are a mixed blessing. Their medicines are harsh, mercury for a cough, laudanum for pain, bleeding or blistering to balance the humors. Sometimes the cure is worse than the disease. Surgery is feared, done without anesthesia for many, an infection is a near certainty. The scent of carbolic acid and the sound of moans fill every hospital ward. The stories of doctors are passed down like ghost tales of lives saved, of lives lost, of miracles and tragedies. Through all of this, faith and superstition weave together. Families keep lucky charms, or say special prayers, hang bunches of lavender or rosemary by the door, leave the window open for fresh air, no matter how cold. The parish priest or minister is called for blessings and comfort, to guide a soul through fever, or to bury the dead when hope is lost. Funerals are common, somber affairs, with neighbors gathering in black, sharing bread and tea, telling stories to comfort the living. Yet, despite the danger, life persists. The city's pulse never stops. Babies are born, laughter echoes through backyards, neighbors recover and return to work. New remedies are tried, old fears put aside. People learn to live with sickness, to find moments of peace between bouts of worry, to take joy in the ordinary, a day without fever, a meal eaten in company, the first signs of spring after a long sickly winter. In Victorian England, health is a luxury, illness a constant companion, and survival itself a daily achievement. Families face each day, not knowing what it will bring, but meeting it with patience, care, and the stubborn will to keep moving forward, no matter how heavy the burden. As the days and nights of Victorian England blurred together, the constant presence of illness wove itself not only through bodies, but also through the patterns of daily life and thought. It was never just about a cough, a fever, or a rash. Sickness lived alongside you, shadowing every plan, every moment of hope, every quiet celebration. There were always reminders, a neighbor's drawn face, the black ribbon on a door, the hush that fell over a room when someone began to wheeze or shiver. For most families, the rituals of home care became as familiar as eating or sleeping. When illness entered the house, routines shifted immediately. Days were pulled closer to the fire, and the sick were wrapped in shawls and extra blankets. Faces turned to the warmth, eyes drifting between sleep and waking. A mother or grandmother sat nearby, spoon in hand, coaxing small sips of broth or water between bouts of coughing. The air was thick with the scent of camphor, vinegar and strong soap, a desperate attempt to keep infection at bay. Every family had a small store of remedies, kept in a tin or on a high shelf: mustard for plasters, onions for poultices, honey and lemon for sore throats, vinegar to cool a feverish brow, and sometimes a bottle of laudanum, opium mixed with alcohol, to dull pain or help a child sleep through the worst of a cough. These were passed down through generations, a blend of hope and tradition, of genuine knowledge and old wives' tales. In the dim evening, A mother might mutter a prayer or recite a rhyme as she worked, seeking comfort as much as cure. Time itself warped in a sick room. Days stretched endlessly, measured in hours between doses, in the rise and fall of a child's breathing, in the soft scrape of a spoon or the sound of wind rattling the window. Nights grew long, broken by restless turns, low moans and the soft creak of a chair as a parent kept vigil. The world shrank to the size of a single room, every sense tuned to the needs of the ill, every thought bending to the uncertain hope of recovery. Outside, life carried on. Street vendors still called, horses clattered by, children played, neighbors gossiped at the pump or exchanged worried looks as news of another sickness spread. If a family's curtains stayed drawn for more than a day or two, everyone in the street knew what it meant. Sometimes neighbors brought soup or bread, a flower, or a whispered suggestion for a new remedy. Other times they kept their distance, afraid of catching whatever affliction had taken root behind the closed door. For those suffering long illness, consumption, rheumatism, or the endless coughing that came with a damp house, life became a pattern of small hopes and slow disappointment. Children wasted away, their laughter fading, skin drawn tight over thin bones, eyes far too wise for their years. The elderly moved more slowly each season, hands curled around a cup for warmth, their stories tinged with memories of those already gone. The chronically ill lived in a limbo, neither fully alive nor truly dying, caught between family care and the world outside. Death, when it came, was rarely a surprise. Still, it brought a hush, a pause in the city's endless movement. Black crepe hung from the door, and neighbors gathered, offering comfort and what food or coin they could spare. The rituals of mourning were strict and solemn, mirrors covered, clocks stopped, all laughter and music banished for a time. Women wore black, sometimes for months or even years. Children were hushed, their play quieted by the weight of loss. Even the city's noises seemed to soften around a house in mourning. Yet, not all stories ended in sorrow. Many recovered, against the odds, and their return to daily life was a cause for celebration. A child who survived a fever was fussed over and cherished. A husband who regained his strength was welcomed home with tears and laughter. Families found joy in the smallest signs of improvement. The first full meal after days of broth, a quiet night's sleep, the first smile or laugh after an illness passed. These moments, small as they were, burned bright against the greyness of worry and fatigue. Medical care, when it came, was an event. Doctors arrived with black bags, their coats dusted with street filth, their faces drawn from too many late nights and difficult cases. Some were skilled and kind, others brusque and hurried, their attention divided by dozens of desperate households. Medicines ranged from helpful to harmful, mercury for infection, bleeding for fever, arsenic or quinine for mysterious maladies, laudanum for pain. Surgery, dreaded above all, was a last resort. The family gathered, hands held, prayers whispered, the sharp scent of carbolic in the air. Recovery was long and uncertain. Hospitals, often cold, crowded, and underfunded, were places of last resort. For many, the idea of leaving home to die among strangers was worse than illness itself. Stories abounded of bad food, neglect, and the unmarked graves of the poor. Still, when desperation struck, the risk was taken. If not for hope of a cure, then for a chance at comfort or relief from the burden of care at home. Mental health, though little understood, suffered as well. The relentless presence of sickness, the grief of repeated loss, the burden of caring for ill loved ones, all wore down the spirit. Mothers and fathers grew anxious, quick to anger or tears. Children, even when well, carried a shadow of fear, a sense that health was fragile, happiness fleeting, and the world forever on the edge of disaster. And yet, through all this, resilience flourished. Families clung to each other in the face of hardship, drawing strength from old songs, shared stories, and the rituals of care. Evenings around the fire were moments of peace, a chance to forget the world's dangers for an hour or two. Communities came together in crisis, offering what they could, a warm loaf, a borrowed blanket, a strong arm at the graveside. Hope was stubborn. New remedies arrived from distant lands, promising a future where fewer children would die, where mothers might live to see their grandchildren, where pain could be eased and wounds might heal. Newspapers brought stories of medical discoveries, of vaccines and clean water, of bold doctors who braved epidemics. These tales sparked dreams, gave comfort, and offered the possibility, however faint, of a life not ruled by illness. As another day ended, and families settled into uneasy sleep, the city's slow, steady heart kept beating. The sick room grew quiet, save for the soft breathing of those who rested, and the watchful presence of those who cared. Outside, the fog drifted along the river, the lamps glowed, and the world spun onward, uncertain and hopeful, through the endless complicated story of Victorian life, and in the morning, there would be new battles, new hopes, and always the quiet unbreakable will to survive. In the world of Victorian England, food was never simply a matter of taste or pleasure. For most it was a daily negotiation, an anxious, uncertain battle fought in the crowded markets, the smoky kitchens, and the hollow ache of empty stomachs. The table, when there was one, was more often a stage for worry than for abundance, and the simple act of eating could shape the mood and memory of an entire household. You might begin your day with little more than a bowl of thin porridge, made from oats and water, perhaps sweetened with a spoonful of treacle, if you were lucky, or a bit of milk, if the cow was giving. For many children, this was not only breakfast, but the best meal of the day. The taste of warmth was fleeting, quickly replaced by the chill of an unheated room and the long hunger that stretched between dawn and dusk. If you lived in the city, the nearest market was a world of sound and smell, a riot of vendors shouting prices, horses stamping, children darting between baskets and barrows. The air was sharp with vinegar, onions, and smoke. Carts lined the streets with stacks of potatoes, carrots, leeks, sometimes a basket of bruised apples, or a few wrinkled plums near the end of their season. Bread sellers competed for custom, their loaves sometimes warm, sometimes already hardening by noon. But food cost money, and money was always tight. Wages, if they came, arrived once a week, and were often spent within hours on rent, coal, and the barest essentials. What remained was carefully counted. Mothers learned to stretch every penny, a bone saved for broth, a crust of bread soaked in milk, scraps of fat collected for frying. Markets had their own social order. Wealthier families bought early, choosing the best cuts and the freshest produce. The poor arrived late, hoping for leftovers, or a price cut as the day wore on. Some waited until dusk, when vendors might sell off wilted greens or cracked eggs for a song, rather than cart them home unsold. Meat was a luxury, rarely seen on the tables of the working class. A small piece of bacon, or a bit of suet might flavor a week's worth of meals, carefully doled out in stews and pies. Sundays, if you were fortunate, might bring a roast, a tiny chicken, or a joint of beef, surrounded by potatoes and a few carrots. But more often, the centerpiece was bread, potatoes, or porridge, filling the stomach, if not satisfying the soul. Children learned early not to complain. They knew the difference between hungry and starving, between a dinner of hot soup and a dinner of tea and dry bread. School children sometimes received free meals, bowls of soup, mugs of milk, a hunk of bread, and these were remembered for years. The shame of poverty was deep, but so was the pride in making do, in never letting neighbors see just how little there really was. Food scarcity colored every part of life. Hunger made tempers short and work harder. Children who lacked food fell behind in school, their minds dulled by the ache in their bellies. Illness, when it came, struck harder and lingered longer in bodies already worn thin. Mothers hid their own hunger, eating less so that children might have more, while fathers took extra work, walked miles for cheaper flour, or bartered odd jobs for a basket of vegetables. Preservation was both an art and a necessity. In summer and autumn, families worked to bottle fruit, pickle vegetables, salt meats, and dry herbs. A pantry lined with jars was a sign of hope, but the bounty never seemed enough to last the winter. Rats and damp could ruin a store in a single night, and the loss was felt with a despair that only the hungry can truly understand. In the countryside, food could be more plentiful, but it was never guaranteed. A bad harvest, a sick cow, or a hailstorm could wipe out the best laid plans. Farmers' children rose early to milk goats, collect eggs, and help in the garden, learning from the start that food did not appear by magic but by sweat, risk, and luck. Village markets brought fresh produce, but prices still rose and fell with the season, and hunger was a visitor in every home at least once in the year. For city dwellers, street food sometimes offered a rare treat: a baked potato from a vendor's cart, a hot eel pie, roasted chestnuts on a winter's night. Penny candies gleamed in shop windows, their colors promising a world of sweetness most would only taste a handful of times in a lifetime. These small luxuries, cherished and rare, were remembered for years, becoming the markers of childhood and celebration. Meals were more than nourishment, they were moments of connection, a family ritual. Even a scant table became a place to gather, to share news, hopes, and jokes. Grace was said, thanks given, and silence observed for those missing or lost. The act of eating together, however meager the fare, was a shield against loneliness, a way to remind everyone that they still belonged to one another. Yet the spectre of the workhouse loomed over the poor. For those truly desperate, unable to afford food or rent, the parish offered relief in the form of outdoor relief, meagre rations brought to your door, or indoor relief, the dreaded workhouse, where families were often separated, and meals were as thin and joyless as the gruel in the bowl. Stories of the workhouse, with its grey uniforms and harsh discipline, haunted every kitchen and whispered at every market stall. Through it all, people found ways to celebrate: a wedding, a birth, a holiday. These were occasions for a feast, however simple. Neighbours pooled resources, shared pies, baked cakes from borrowed eggs, and a bit of saved sugar. The memory of these meals warmed families through the coldest winters, becoming legend in the telling. The apple tart made from windfall fruit, the roast that fed a dozen, the plum pudding on Christmas Day. As the day faded, and families gathered around the fire for a supper of bread and cheese, there was comfort in togetherness, if not in plenty. Hunger was a companion, but so was hope, the hope that tomorrow's market would be cheaper, that work would last, that the potato crop would hold, that spring would bring fresh greens and a little relief. For most in Victorian England, to eat was to struggle, to hope, and sometimes to go without. Yet, in the face of so much uncertainty, families persisted, finding meaning and connection in the rituals of the table, the sharing of a loaf, and the promise, always just ahead, of better days to come. As another evening crept into Victorian England, the question of what would be served for supper became both a practical and emotional weight. The end of the workday did not guarantee a good meal. Instead, it often brought renewed worry, as mothers and fathers opened cupboards and baskets, tallying the remains of the week's supplies and stretching them as far as possible. For many, the act of preparing food was a small miracle performed daily. A bit of flour, a knob of lard, a leftover potato, a handful of limp greens. These meagre ingredients became soups, stews, pies, and porridges, through ingenuity and sheer necessity. Recipes were not written in books, but passed from parent to child, shaped by tradition, chance, and the realities of scarcity. A family recipe might be nothing more than a clever way to disguise old bread or make a weak broth taste like something more. Cooking was a laborious, time-consuming task. In cramped city homes, the kitchen might be little more than a hearth and a battered table. Wood or coal was precious, used carefully to make a single fire last through the night. Pots and pans, if a family was lucky enough to have more than one, were handed down for generations, their surfaces worn smooth by use. Everything was reused. Fat saved from one meal became the base for the next. Bones were boiled for hours to coax out every drop of nutrition, and even the water used to boil vegetables might be sipped as a kind of thin, warming soup. Children watched these rituals, learning early that waste was a luxury no one could afford. Leftovers were stored under cloths, sometimes in a cool corner of the house, sometimes in a larder dug below the floorboards. Bread that had gone stale was turned into puddings, or fried for breakfast. The peelings from potatoes and apples, if clean, could be added to the next day's pot. Nothing was thrown away without careful thought. In times of particular hardship, mothers sometimes invented meals with little more than imagination and willpower. A bowl of water thickened with oats, a bit of salt and onion, became supper. On lean weeks, supper might be bread alone, perhaps dipped in tea or milk to soften it for the youngest children. There was pride in making do, in never admitting to neighbours just how thin the fare had become. Hunger shaped not only bodies, but minds and spirits. It made tempers short, made children listless or restless at school, made adults lie awake at night worrying about the next day's meals. But it also created strong bonds. Families learned to share fairly, to comfort one another in lean times, to laugh over the smallest treats, and to remember with fondness even the most modest celebrations. The rhythm of the seasons governed much of the diet. In spring, wild greens and herbs appeared, foraged from roadsides or gardens. Summer brought berries, and the hope of a few plump apples or pears. Autumn, the harvest of potatoes, carrots, onions, turnips, and sometimes a glut of cheap plums or damsons. Winter was the leanest time, when the cellars grew empty, and meals grew thin. Those who could, preserved what they could: cabbage pickled in vinegar, apples dried in rings, a few jars of jam made from windfall fruit. Feasts, when they happened, were communal affairs. A wedding or a christening, a holiday like Christmas or Easter, brought neighbours together around shared tables. Pies, cakes, and roasts appeared as if by magic, each family contributing what they could: a pot of beans, a plate of sweets, a loaf of bread fresh from the oven. These moments, rare as they were, shone in memory, retold over and over in the long, hungry months that followed. For those who could not make ends meet, charity was both a blessing and a source of shame. Churches and missions sometimes provided soup kitchens, offering bowls of hot broth and bread to the poorest. Children queued with tin cups, mothers waited with shawls pulled tight, grateful but quietly embarrassed. Stories spread of those who lived off charity, and even the most desperate tried to avoid that label if they could. The spectre of the workhouse was always present. Inside, meals were strictly rationed: thin porridge, gruel, a piece of bread, a hunk of cheese on Sundays. Rules were enforced with severity, and the act of eating was stripped of pleasure, reduced to mere survival. Families did everything they could to avoid this fate, working extra hours, taking in laundry, pawning their few belongings, or sending children to work rather than accept parish relief. Yet even in the face of scarcity there was kindness. Neighbors shared what little they could: a spoonful of sugar, a cup of flour, a bit of dripping for a sick child. A loaf of bread appeared on a doorstep when someone was ill, or a pot of stew was sent to a house in mourning. These small gestures became lifelines, reminders that even in the hardest times, no one was truly alone. Food was memory, hope, and connection. The story of a favorite dish was told with pride: how grandmother made it, how a neighbor taught the trick, how it cheered a child on a cold morning. The loss of a recipe, or the inability to make a familiar treat, was felt deeply, a mark of changing times, of hardship endured. As the night deepened and families finished the last crumbs of supper, there was a moment of peace. The fire burned low, children dozed in laps or on the floor, and adults shared quiet conversation or simply watched the flames. Hunger might remain, but so did love, laughter, and the hope that tomorrow would bring something more: a basket of apples, a fresh loaf, a pot of stew bubbling on the stove. In the gentle dark, the city's pulse slowed, and the dreams of better meals and brighter days mingled with the memories of what had been shared. For all its struggles, the simple act of gathering at the table was a small victory, a promise kept, a story carried forward, a testament to endurance in the face of never quite enough. As the night settled fully over Victorian England, the walls of every home seemed to draw closer, their brick and plaster holding not just the day's warmth, but also its noise, its secrets, its struggles. In these small rooms, life was lived at a distance of a few feet, a closeness that could be a comfort, a burden, or in many cases, both at once. Overcrowding was the rule, not the exception. In a single room, a whole family might try to fit itself around a narrow bed, a battered chest, and the little space left for movement. Sometimes, especially in the poorest districts, there were lodgers, other men or women who paid a few coins for a corner or a spot on the floor. On bitter winter nights, as many as a dozen people might share a space barely big enough for a modern living room. The heat from so many bodies kept the worst of the cold away, but it also stifled the air and made tempers short. Every morning began with the choreography of bodies shifting and twisting, rolling off mattresses or floorboards, pulling on clothes in the semi-darkness, all while careful not to step on a neighbor or wake a baby. Privacy did not exist. You washed your face with a handful of cold water, dressed behind a half-open cupboard, and learned not to notice if someone else was doing the same in the other corner. Couples argued in whispers, secrets were kept in glances, and children quickly figured out when it was best to slip out into the street to play. The shared routines were unending. As soon as one person finished with the tin tub, another took their turn splashing water over themselves and hoping no one would barge in. Meals were cooked one at a time on the same hearth. Porridge for the youngest, tea for the oldest, whatever could be stretched to fill all the bowls before the pot ran dry. After eating, the table was cleared for mending, homework, or the business of the day. Laundry was scrubbed by hand, hung on every line and chair, and never seemed to dry completely, the dampness creeping into clothing and bedding alike. Smells became part of the atmosphere: cabbage boiling, socks drying, babies' diapers soaking in a bucket, a trace of coal smoke always lingering in the air. You grew used to it, in the way that only necessity can teach. Ventilation was a luxury: windows, when they could be opened, let in cold air and soot as much as they let out steam and smells. Noise was everywhere. At all hours you could hear the lives of others, footsteps above and below, a baby crying next door, the laughter or argument of a family across the hall. The city's sounds poured in through cracks and open panes, carriages rolling past, peddlers shouting, church bells marking time, and the distant whistle of a train. To a visitor, the cacophony would be overwhelming, but to those who lived here, it was simply the sound of being alive. Children had little room to play indoors. Most games spilled out onto the street, or the shared yard. Indoors, they made do with quiet amusements, clapping games, riddles, sometimes a makeshift doll or a ball of rags. The lack of space taught children to be resourceful, but it also meant they were often underfoot, leading to scoldings or the gentle but firm suggestion to go outside and let your mother work. On rainy days, a game might be played under the table, or stories whispered beneath blankets to pass the long hours. Home was a place of work as much as rest. Many women ran small businesses from their kitchens, taking in sewing, laundry or piecework for local factories. Men mended shoes, sharpened knives, or fixed umbrellas, hoping to earn an extra penny. Children might wind thread, fold papers, or polish boots. Every task was performed in the same tight quarters, and every spare moment was used to keep the family afloat. Tensions inevitably arose. In a space where it was impossible to be alone, small slights became magnified. A harsh word could start a quarrel that the thin walls ensured everyone heard. Siblings squabbled over blankets, mothers snapped at children for leaving muddy footprints on the scrubbed floor, and fathers brooded over unpaid rent, their frustration a silent cloud in the cramped air. But reconciliation was often just as quick, necessity teaching the art of apology, forgiveness, and moving forward. Health suffered too. Crowded rooms and poor ventilation meant that coughs and fevers spread quickly. One child's illness could become the whole family's struggle. Tuberculosis, influenza, measles, all thrived in such environments, and the death of a child or parent was a sorrow that echoed in every neighboring home. Yet, with each loss, neighbors gathered, sometimes bringing bread, sometimes just a word or a presence, each person knowing that the same fate could come to their own family at any time. Yet, it wasn't all struggle and sadness. These homes, despite their challenges, were also filled with moments of light, of laughter, music, storytelling, and the stubborn, everyday joy of togetherness. Evenings by the fire became an opportunity to bond. A father might sing an old song, a mother might recount a memory from her childhood, and children listened, learning the family's story. Sometimes a neighbor joined, bringing news or gossip, and the crowded room felt, for a while, like a celebration. Festivities and holidays, though simple, were cherished all the more. A birthday might mean a single sweet or a candle in a bit of bread, but it was a feast of delight for a child who rarely tasted sugar. At Christmas, families scraped together coins for a little meat, a pie, or perhaps even a bit of fruit. The act of sharing, of pooling meager resources, made each treat taste richer. In the late hours, when all grew quiet, there was space for dreams. Parents planned for the future, hoping for a better room, a move to a less crowded street, maybe even a cottage with a patch of garden. Children dreamed of adventure, inspired by the stories told as they drifted off to sleep. In that hush, for a few precious minutes, the hardships receded, and hope took their place. Through all the discomfort and the noise, the lack of privacy, and the worries about the next week's rent, people endured. They found ways to care for each other, to create beauty out of scarcity, and to carve out meaning within narrow walls. The home, small as it was, became a world, a place of challenge, but also of belonging, memory, and the kind of love that is forged not in luxury, but in adversity. And so, as another night settled over the city, and families closed their eyes in crowded beds, the story of Victorian home life continued, one of struggle, resilience, and the endless hope that tomorrow might bring a little more space, a little more comfort, and always, a little more peace. To live in Victorian England was to move through an invisible web of rules, a network spun from social class, respectability, and an unending need to show the world you belonged, or at least that you deserved a place in it. Every street, shop, and public square was a stage, and everyone who stepped outside their own door became an actor, whether they wished to or not. From the moment you entered the street, you were judged by your clothes, your accent, your posture, the company you kept, and even the very speed of your walk. A patched dress or a frayed collar could mean the difference between being welcomed and being turned away. Shoes, polished or muddy, signaled not just your attention to cleanliness, but your standing in the world. Children were taught young to walk straight, to speak softly, and to answer politely, knowing that a single misstep could bring shame not only on themselves, but on the whole family. At the top of the social pyramid were the aristocracy and gentry, the lords, ladies, and landed families who filled the pages of novels and the columns of the society pages. Their world was one of privilege, privacy, and power, shielded by gates, high walls, and the careful curation of reputation. For them, public life was a matter of display. Carriages with fine horses, gowns of silk and lace, evenings at the theatre or the opera, and long afternoons spent in private parks or manicured gardens. Invitations, introductions, and alliances shaped their futures, and every action was weighed for its impact on the family name. For the growing middle class, shopkeepers, clerks, teachers, tradesmen, and skilled workers, respectability was both goal and anxiety. They worked hard not just to earn a living, but to prove themselves worthy of advancement. Every penny spent was a calculation, every purchase a step in a social dance, a new bonnet for a daughter, a piano for the parlor, a subscription to a lending library. These were not just pleasures, but investments in status, signs that a family was rising in the world. The rules of behavior were strict, sometimes bewilderingly so. Men tipped their hats to acquaintances, women curtsied, children bowed or bobbed. Conversation was measured, rarely straying into politics or personal matters, unless among intimates. To appear in public without a glove or a hat was unthinkable for a lady. For a gentleman, a failure to offer a hand to a woman crossing the street, or to stand when someone entered the room could mark him as ill-bred. For the working class, the vast majority, public life was another test. Every action, every word, every gesture was weighed against the fear of being seen as rough or common. Parents drilled into their children the importance of cleanliness, good manners, and humility. A well-washed face and tidy hair might open doors, while a careless word or a stained apron could close them just as quickly. Charity was both blessing and burden. The wealthy were expected to give, but the poor were expected to show gratitude, humility, and an eagerness to improve. Recipients of charity were judged not just for their need, but for their attitude and appearance. Were they trying hard enough? Were they truly deserving? The fear of being labelled undeserving haunted every visit to the parish office, every appeal for relief. Opportunities for advancement were few, but never absent. A clever boy might win a scholarship to a better school, a diligent apprentice could hope to start his own shop, a housemaid might become a housekeeper, or even, in the rarest of cases, marry above her station. Each step up the ladder required not just hard work, but the careful navigation of social codes, knowing when to speak, when to listen, when to defer, and when to show just enough ambition to be noticed, but not enough to be seen as impertinent. In public spaces, the divisions were visible and enforced. Parks were divided by railings, benches marked for ladies only, libraries and galleries separated by subscription fees or dress codes. Churches, too, were marked by class pews rented by the year, the best seats reserved for those who paid the most. Even funerals followed the rules, processions, mourner's dress, and the quality of the coffin all signaling a family standing to the watching world. Entertainment was shaped by class as much as pleasure. Theatres offered private boxes for the wealthy, galleries for the middle class, and cheap seats or standing room for the rest. Public houses, pubs were the social centres of working-class neighbourhoods, places to share news, find work, or simply escape the pressures of the day. Tea rooms, coffee shops and clubs flourished among the middle classes, offering spaces to socialise under the watchful eyes of peers. Women's lives especially were shaped by respectability. A woman's reputation was her most valuable asset, and a single scandal, real or rumoured, could ruin not just her prospects, but her family's as well. Courtship was strictly chaperoned, correspondence monitored, friendships chosen with care. Married women managed the home, upheld the family's social standing, and raised children to do the same. For men, work and public behaviour went hand in hand. A man's handshake, his willingness to pay a debt, his conduct in the street or at the pub, all became markers by which he was measured. Stories of self-made men inspired hope, but everyone knew that luck, contacts and the goodwill of others mattered as much as effort. Children absorbed these lessons early, watching and imitating, learning to judge others and themselves by an ever-shifting standard of success. To be respectable was to belong, to be safe, to be seen, to be given a chance. To fall short, even for a moment, was to risk exclusion, gossip, or worse. Through it all, the class system was both a cage and a comfort. It offered stability, predictability, and the hope, however faint, of progress. It also enforced limits, shamed ambition, and kept millions in their appointed place. The struggle to rise was real, but so was the fear of falling. And so, every trip to the market, every Sunday walk, every moment in the public eye was a careful balancing act. You checked your shoes, your manners, your words. You stood a little straighter, smiled when spoken to, and hoped that today, at least, you would pass as respectable in the eyes of your world. For those living in Victorian England, the boundaries of class and public life were not only visible, but constantly reinforced in 1,000 small, exhausting ways. The daily act of passing, presenting oneself as clean, orderly, and worthy of respect, was not just about pride, but about survival. Every public encounter, from the market to the parish church to the bustling omnibus, was a test, and no matter how careful you were, it was never quite possible to forget your place, nor the consequences if you slipped. Take, for example, a simple visit to the market. The wealthy arrived early, riding in carriages or accompanied by a maid. Vendors greeted them with deference, saving the best produce or freshest bread. Middle-class women, aspiring to gentility, walked carefully through the rows of stalls, gloves on hands, reticules tight against their skirts, eyes cast downward to avoid gossip. They compared prices quietly, asking after one another's health, and exchanging small, polite compliments. For the working class, the market was a more anxious place. Every penny counted, and every bargain was hard won. Vendors haggled, children begged, and eyes watched for a moment's inattention that might lead to a lost purse or a quick rebuke from someone higher on the social ladder. Even public transport reflected the rigid order of class. Omnibuses, trains and cabs were marked by price, destination, and sometimes even the quality of seating. A servant or laborer would squeeze onto a hard bench beside other workers, keeping bags close and voices low. A shopkeeper, careful to present himself well, might spend an extra penny to ride in a cleaner, quieter compartment, hoping to be mistaken for a man of means, even if only for the journey's length. For the upper classes, private carriages or first-class tickets were both a convenience and a symbol, signaling their distance from the struggles below. Public parks, those lungs of the city, were spaces where class played out in subtle and not-so-subtle ways. Certain lawns, paths and benches were reserved for those of the right status or the right subscription. A governess might bring her charges to the edge of a private square, never stepping past the iron gates, while nannies watched from the other side, separated by invisible yet inviolable rules. Children learned early where they could and could not play, and which games, hoops, skipping, tag, were proper for their station. The emotional cost of constant vigilance was high. To keep up appearances required effort, mending clothing to disguise wear, borrowing a neighbor's hat for church, practicing polite speech at home so it would not slip in public. The dread of being recognized as out of place haunted every outing, especially for those hovering on the edge between classes. Mothers warned daughters to walk with care, to never be seen laughing too loudly, to avoid the company of those with bad character. Fathers checked their children's shoes, their posture, their manners, knowing that a single misstep could mean lost work or social shame. Inside the home, the performance continued. Middle-class families arranged their parlors with as much taste as they could afford, displaying family Bibles, prints or bits of china, as proof of refinement. Visiting friends or relatives, tea was poured with ceremony, cakes served on the best plates, and conversation steered away from topics too close to poverty or hardship. Even the poor, in their way, staged their homes, scrubbing floors, hanging curtains, tacking up a flower picture cut from a magazine, creating dignity from the materials at hand. Charity events, church services, and local festivals were other arenas for the social dance. At a church bazaar or holiday fete, everyone watched everyone else, who contributed, who took too much, who arrived dressed above or below their means. Charity meant to ease suffering, sometimes became a source of further judgment. To be seen as deserving required the proper humility and gratitude. To be labeled a scrounger could bring lifelong disgrace. The rules of class shaped even the most personal milestones. Courtship, marriage and family life were public matters, with every match scrutinized for its impact on standing and respectability. An ambitious shopgirl might dream of marrying a clerk, but knew that her accent, her family, or even her shoes could doom her hopes. Parents arranged apprenticeships and positions for sons, domestic work for daughters, always thinking not only of wages, but of respect, and the hope of better prospects in the next generation. And as people grew older, the challenges of class changed shape. A child who won a scholarship to a good school became a source of pride, but also anxiety. Would he forget his place? Would she be too grand for her own people? Aging parents worried about becoming a burden, the threat of the workhouse always in the background. The stories of families who fell, through illness, bad luck, or the whim of an employer, were told and retold as cautionary tales. Yet, in all this performance, there were small acts of rebellion and kindness. Sometimes a middle-class woman shared a recipe with her laundress, or a clerk vouched for a neighbor in need. A well-off family might discreetly pay a widow's rent, or buy shoes for a friend's child. Working men formed clubs and societies to support each other, pooling pennies for funerals, sickness, or the education of a clever son. In the evenings, when the curtains were drawn, families relaxed, accents softened, laughter grew louder, and the pressures of class faded for a little while. Over time, change crept in at the edges. Factories and cities brought people of different backgrounds together, and small fortunes were sometimes made by those with luck, grit, and timing. Public education, though basic, gave new hope to many. Reformers argued for better housing, cleaner streets, and more humane treatment of the poor. Newspapers carried stories of invention, politics, and social mobility. feeding dreams of escape, however distant. Still, for most, the boundaries of class held firm. The cost of respectability, measured in coin, in pride, in daily vigilance, remained high. The rewards too were real, a sense of belonging, a hope for the future, a small piece of dignity, in a world where so much could be lost so easily. And so, from cradle to grave, the people of Victorian England navigated this maze of public life and social code. In every handshake, every borrowed bonnet, every careful greeting at the market, or in the pew, they performed the rituals of class, sometimes with pride, sometimes with exhaustion, always with the hope that tomorrow might bring a little more respect, a little more ease, and maybe, for their children, a chance to step a little higher on the ladder of society. In Victorian England, even the simple act of moving from one place to another was never as easy as it might sound. For most people, travel was a daily trial, a matter of time, energy, and often discomfort. The ways in which people got around and the limits placed on their journeys shaped nearly every other part of their lives. In the great cities, London, Manchester, Birmingham, the streets were alive from the earliest dawn. Horses' hooves echoed across cobblestones, the wheels of carts and omnibuses clattered ceaselessly, and the calls of drivers, porters, and peddlers filled the air with a constant, restless hum. But for all this motion, very few people owned or even rode in carriages of their own. The sight of a private carriage, with its shining horses and well-dressed passengers, marked out the wealthy immediately. For everyone else, the journey was a challenge to be faced on foot, by omnibus, or on the crowded, noisy new trains. Most working people walked. The day began with a long trudge through fog or rain, over streets slick with mud or littered with the refuse of yesterday's market. Shoes wore thin, soles patched again and again, until there was hardly any original leather left. Children hurried alongside parents, dodging traffic, careful not to slip in the filth that filled every gutter. Distances were measured in the time it took to reach work, school, or market. Half an hour, sometimes more each way. For the very poor, the walk might be 5 miles or more, taken in all weather, day after day. If you had a penny or two to spare, you might catch an omnibus. These horse-drawn carriages rumbled along the city's main routes, stopping for passengers who waved them down with a handkerchief or a call. Climbing aboard meant squeezing in among strangers, pressing close in the crowded, swaying cabin, jostled by every rut in the road. The benches were hard, the air thick with sweat, tobacco, and the dampness of too many bodies packed together. On cold days, breath fogged the windows. On hot days, the cabin became stifling, and tempers often flared. Yet the omnibus was a blessing for those whose legs ached, whose boots leaked, or whose destination was simply too far for comfort. Cabs, hansom, or four-wheeled, were another option, but an expensive one. To hail a cab was a sign of urgency or relative comfort. Perhaps a family hurrying to the doctor, a clerk running late for work, or a small group carrying heavy parcels. Cab drivers knew their customers well, sometimes bending the rules for regulars, or charging a little extra when the rain was heavy and demand high. The introduction of the railway changed the city's rhythms. Trains, at first the marvel of the age, quickly became part of daily life for thousands. Stations thrummed with activity, porters calling out destinations, crowds jostling for tickets, the sharp scent of coal smoke hanging in the air. For those who could afford it, the train opened up new possibilities, living farther from work, visiting family in the countryside, or even taking a rare day at the seaside. Yet, even here, class was visible in every compartment, first, second, and third, each with its own level of comfort, cleanliness, and crowding. Travel by train brought its own discomforts. Third-class cars were often open to the wind, hard-seated and cold in winter. The noise was unending, the motion rough, and for those not used to it, the speed could be dizzying. But the train was a miracle of the new age, a promise of speed and connection, even if it rarely felt luxurious. In the countryside, travel remained much as it had for generations. People walked or rode horseback, or if they were prosperous, travelled by gig or cart. Village lanes turned to mud in the rain, and hills could be nearly impassable in winter. Mail coaches rattled along main roads, but stops were few, and fares high. For most, leaving the village, or visiting another town, was a rare event, sometimes undertaken only a few times in a lifetime. Perhaps for a wedding, a funeral, or a new job. Weather shaped every journey. Rain meant soaked clothes and cold feet. Heat meant dust and thirst. Fog brought confusion, lost tempers, and sometimes danger. The city's famous pea soup fogs could be so thick, that people lost their way just a street from home, and drivers tied lanterns to their carts and cabs to avoid collisions. In winter, ice turned every step into a risk, and in summer, the stench of the city's refuse made even a short walk unpleasant. For women, travel held extra challenges. The need for respectability meant that they rarely walked alone, and public transport was sometimes considered unseemly or even dangerous after dark. Many women timed their errands for the safest hours, traveling in groups when they could, and carrying themselves with the wary posture of those who knew the world could be unfriendly. Children navigated the city on their own, running errands, carrying water or coal, or fetching bread from the bakers. Their knowledge of alleys, courtyards and back streets was second only to their ability to slip through crowds unnoticed. Yet, accidents were common: injuries from carts, encounters with stray dogs, and the dangers of getting lost in a world too large for small feet. To visit family or friends required careful planning. Letters were sent ahead, train times checked, money saved for weeks just to afford the fare. A trip to the seaside, or a distant village, was cause for excitement, a break in the routine of work and worry. These journeys became treasured memories, retold around the fire on winter nights. The thrill of seeing the ocean, the strangeness of new places, the laughter and exhaustion of a day spent in motion. Yet, for most, life's boundaries were set by what could be reached on foot. Neighborhoods formed along these lines, with every shopkeeper, schoolmaster, and market woman a familiar figure. News spread quickly along these well-worn routes, and everyone knew who belonged and who did not. The act of traveling outside your own district was both an adventure and a risk, marking you as a stranger until proven otherwise. As the sun set and the city's lights flickered to life, the streets filled again with people on their way home. Boots scraped stone, voices drifted from doorways, and the slow, weary rhythm of return marked the end of another long day. For a few hours, the city quieted, but the memory of the day's journeys, long or short, easy or hard, remained in every tired body, every patched shoe, and every story told at the hearth. And so in Victorian England, transportation was not just a matter of convenience, but of endurance. Each journey was a test, each mile a small victory, and every safe return home a reason to be thankful. Moving through the world meant braving crowds, weather, class barriers, and the endless unpredictability of life itself. In Victorian England, even the simple act of moving from one place to another was never as easy as it might sound. For most people, travel was a daily trial, a matter of time, energy, and often discomfort. The ways in which people got around, and the limits placed on their journeys, shaped nearly every other part of their lives. In the great cities, London, Manchester, Birmingham, the streets were alive from the earliest dawn. Horses' hooves echoed across cobblestones, the wheels of carts and omnibuses clattered ceaselessly, and the calls of drivers, porters, and peddlers filled the air with a constant restless hum. But for all this motion, very few people owned or even rode in carriages of their own. The sight of a private carriage, with its shining horses and well-dressed passengers, marked out the wealthy immediately. For everyone else, the journey was a challenge to be faced on foot, by omnibus, or on the crowded, noisy new trains. Most working people walked. The day began with a long trudge through fog or rain, over streets slick with mud, or littered with the refuse of yesterday's market. Shoes wore thin, soles patched again and again until there was hardly any original leather left. Children hurried alongside parents, dodging traffic, careful not to slip in the filth that filled every gutter. Distances were measured in the time it took to reach work, school, or market, half an hour, sometimes more each way. For the very poor, the walk might be 5 miles or more, taken in all weather, day after day. If you had a penny or two to spare, you might catch an omnibus. These horse-drawn carriages rumbled along the city's main routes, stopping for passengers who waved them down with a handkerchief or a call. Climbing aboard meant squeezing in among strangers, pressing close in the crowded, swaying cabin, jostled by every rut in the road. The benches were hard, the air thick with sweat, tobacco, and the dampness of too many bodies packed together. On cold days, breath fogged the windows. On hot days, the cabin became stifling, and tempers often flared. Yet the omnibus was a blessing for those whose legs ached, whose boots leaked, or whose destination was simply too far for comfort. Cabs, hansom or four-wheeled, were another option, but an expensive one. To hail a cab was a sign of urgency or relative comfort. Perhaps a family hurrying to the doctor, a clerk running late for work, or a small group carrying heavy parcels. Cab drivers knew their customers well, sometimes bending the rules for regulars or charging a little extra when the rain was heavy and demand high. The introduction of the railway changed the city's rhythms. Trains, at first the marvel of the age, quickly became part of daily life for thousands. Stations thrummed with activity, porters calling out destinations, crowds jostling for tickets, the sharp scent of coal smoke hanging in the air. For those who could afford it, the train opened up new possibilities, living farther from work, visiting family in the countryside, or even taking a rare day at the seaside. Yet, even here, class was visible in every compartment, first, second and third, each with its own level of comfort, cleanliness and crowding. Travel by train brought its own discomforts. Third-class cars were often open to the wind, hard-seated and cold in winter. The noise was unending, the motion rough, and for those not used to it, the speed could be dizzying. But the train was a miracle of the new age, a promise of speed and connection, even if it rarely felt luxurious. In the countryside, travel remained much as it had for generations. People walked or rode horseback, or if they were prosperous, travelled by gig or cart. Village lanes turned to mud in the rain, and hills could be nearly impassable in winter. Mail coaches rattled along main roads, but stops were few, and fares high. For most, leaving the village or visiting another town was a rare event, sometimes undertaken only a few times in a lifetime, perhaps for a wedding, a funeral, or a new job. Weather shaped every journey. Rain meant soaked clothes and cold feet. Heat meant dust and thirst. Fog brought confusion, lost tempers and sometimes danger. The city's famous pea soup fogs could be so thick that people lost their way just a street from home, and drivers tied lanterns to their carts and cabs to avoid collisions. In winter, ice turned every step into a risk, and in summer, the stench of the city's refuse made even a short walk unpleasant. For women, travel held extra challenges. The need for respectability meant that they rarely walked alone, and public transport was sometimes considered unseemly, or even dangerous after dark. Many women timed their errands for the safest hours, traveling in groups when they could, and carrying themselves with the wary posture of those who knew the world could be unfriendly. Children navigated the city on their own, running errands, carrying water or coal, or fetching bread from the bakers. Their knowledge of alleys, courtyards and back streets was second only to their ability to slip through crowds unnoticed. Yet, accidents were common. Injuries from carts, encounters with stray dogs, and the dangers of getting lost in a world too large for small feet. To visit family or friends required careful planning. Letters were sent ahead, train times checked, money saved for weeks just to afford the fare. A trip to the seaside, or a distant village, was cause for excitement, a break in the routine of work and worry. These journeys became treasured memories, retold around the fire on winter nights. The thrill of seeing the ocean, the strangeness of new places, the laughter and exhaustion of a day spent in motion. Yet, for most, life's boundaries were set by what could be reached on foot. Neighborhoods formed along these lines, with every shopkeeper, schoolmaster, and market woman a familiar figure. News spread quickly along these well-worn routes, and everyone knew who belonged and who did not. The act of traveling outside your own district was both an adventure and a risk, marking you as a stranger until proven otherwise. As the sun set, and the city's lights flickered to life, the streets filled again with people on their way home. Boots scraped stone, voices drifted from doorways, and the slow, weary rhythm of return marked the end of another long day. For a few hours the city quieted, but the memory of the day's journeys, long or short, easy or hard, remained in every tired body, every patched shoe, and every story told at the hearth. And so in Victorian England, transportation was not just a matter of convenience, but of endurance. Each journey was a test, each mile a small victory, and every safe return home, a reason to be thankful. Moving through the world meant braving crowds, weather, class barriers, and the endless unpredictability of life itself. Night falls differently in Victorian England. As the sun slips behind rooftops and factory chimneys, shadows lengthen in every alleyway, and the world takes on a sharper, quieter edge. In these hours, the threat of crime and danger becomes more than just rumor. It settles into the streets themselves, into the careful steps of women hurrying home, the nervous glances exchanged by neighbors, and the quiet rituals families use to keep themselves safe. For many, the city is both a protector and a predator. Its crowds offer anonymity, but also risk. In the tight quarters of poor neighborhoods where strangers pass by your window every hour, the fear of theft is never far away. Petty crimes, pickpocketing, burglary, street scams are daily occurrences. Children are taught early to guard their pockets, to keep a hand on their baskets, to trust few and watch everyone. The loss of a purse, a loaf of bread, or even a pair of shoes can mean hunger or worse. Some crimes are crimes of opportunity, born from desperation. A hungry child might snatch an apple from a cart. An out-of-work man might slip a hand through an open window, in the hope of finding a few coins. In the crowded markets, nimble fingers work quickly, and cries of "Stop thief" echo over the stalls. Sometimes there is pity for the thief, a neighbor down on his luck, a widow with too many mouths to feed. Other times there is anger, and the punishment, if caught, is swift and harsh. Violent crime is rarer but feared. The stories spread quickly: a fight in a pub gone wrong, a robbery on a dark lane, a knife drawn in a quarrel over wages or love. For women, the fear of violence is a constant, shaping their movements, their friendships, their habits. Few walk alone after dark. Mothers warn daughters, and fathers walk loved ones home when they can. Even in the safety of home, locks are checked and checked again, and the scrape of a stranger's boot outside can bring fear well into the night. The police, still a relatively new presence in the Victorian world, are both a reassurance and a cause for anxiety. Peelers and bobbies, in their tall helmets and blue coats, patrol the main streets, swinging lanterns and truncheons, their footsteps familiar to anyone listening in the dark. For some, the sight of a constable brings comfort, a sign that order is being kept, that someone is watching. For others, especially the poor and the unlucky, the police are a source of worry, a reminder that the law is not always fair, and that innocence does not guarantee safety. Policing itself is uneven. In wealthier districts, officers are quick to respond, neighbors watch out for each other, and crimes are investigated with care. In the poorer quarters, the police are overworked, sometimes indifferent, and often mistrusted. The rules are enforced with a heavy hand. Public drunkenness, loitering and vagrancy are punished harshly, while crimes against the poor themselves can go unreported and unpunished. The justice system is a world apart, its language strange and intimidating. To be accused, even falsely, is to risk ruin. Trials move quickly, evidence is scarce, and punishments are severe. A few weeks hard labor for theft, transportation for repeat offenders, and for the worst crimes the hangman's rope. Children, too, are caught in this net, sometimes sentenced as harshly as adults for small acts of desperation. The workhouse, the prison, and the asylum are all feared as much as poverty itself. Yet, through all this, people find ways to protect themselves and each other. Neighbors keep watch, sharing warnings and news of trouble. Families pool resources to replace what's been lost. Community ties are strong. A knock at the door in the night brings help, not just suspicion. Children learn who to trust, which corners to avoid, and how to spot danger before it arrives. Stories of crime and justice fill the newspapers, become the subject of gossip and cautionary tales. Did you hear about the break-in on Church Lane? They caught the thief who stole from the baker last week. These stories shape how people move, how they sleep, how they judge one another. At the same time, tales of clever escapes, of justice done, or of unexpected kindness, a lost item returned, a warning whispered, become small beacons of hope in a world so often marked by uncertainty. For some, danger and excitement are two sides of the same coin. The city's underworld has its own rules, its own codes of honor and revenge. Gangs form in the poorest neighborhoods, both as a means of survival, and as a way to resist the powers that be. Children join for protection, for belonging, for the thrill of defying the law that seems to offer them little else. But for most, the goal is simple: to keep one's head down, to avoid notice, to reach home safely each night. Rituals emerge, lanterns left burning, doors double locked, prayers whispered before sleep. Over time, the presence of danger becomes part of the fabric of life, shaping routines and expectations in ways both obvious and subtle. As midnight comes and the city quiets, the fears of the day recede, replaced by the softer anxieties of home. The world outside feels far away, yet never entirely gone. Children listen to stories of highwaymen and clever detectives, falling asleep to the rhythms of caution and hope. In Victorian England, safety was never certain, yet, in the face of crime and chaos, ordinary people found ways to persevere, trusting in neighbors, building networks of care, and holding tight to the hope that tomorrow might be a little safer, a little kinder, and a little more secure. The reality of crime in Victorian England did more than fill the newspapers. It shaped every aspect of life, from the way people locked their doors to the stories they told at the fireside. Fear was both practical and deeply emotional, altering habits, relationships, and the rhythms of every day. Nighttime in the city brought special anxieties. Families drew curtains tightly, checked windows, and stuffed rags into any gap that might let in not only cold but also prying eyes. Lanterns were trimmed and left burning in the smallest rooms. In wealthier homes, a servant might keep watch in the hallway. Even so, the darkness outside was alive with sounds, footsteps echoing in deserted alleys, distant laughter from a tavern, the occasional sharp whistle of a constable on patrol. Children learned to distinguish between the normal creaks of a settling house and the more ominous noises that signaled trouble. Inside, conversations turned to crime almost as often as to work or weather. Parents warned children not to talk to strangers, not to linger on certain corners, not to trust everyone who claimed to be a friend. Stories of pickpockets, housebreakers, and highwaymen were retold with every new incident, each one growing a little in the telling, the lessons embedded deeper each time. In some neighborhoods, bad men were less shadow than fact. A neighbor's son who had fallen in with the wrong crowd, a local family suddenly shunned after a string of thefts. Despite this vigilance, crime could strike anywhere. The randomness of it all bred a deep sense of vulnerability. A missing bundle of laundry, a broken window, a handful of coins vanished from a drawer. These small losses piled up, reminders that safety was always provisional, always subject to fate. Some families grew fatalistic, accepting theft or even violence as the price of city life. Others grew harder, trusting less, keeping secrets, and locking away not just their valuables, but also their faith in others. Justice, such as it was, depended heavily on luck and reputation. If a crime was committed against someone of means or influence, police responded quickly. Witnesses were gathered, evidence hunted, suspects rounded up, sometimes with more energy than care. For the poor or powerless, the process was slower, and the outcome far less certain. To be accused, rightly or wrongly, was to risk humiliation, loss of work, even transportation or the gallows. Many innocent people were swept up in the rush to judgment. The police, under pressure to solve crimes, sometimes looked for easy scapegoats: a stranger in the neighborhood, a man with a record, a family already marked as trouble. Trials were hurried affairs. The accused often denied a real chance to defend themselves. For minor crimes, sentences were severe: hard labor, public flogging, or months in a dank, disease-ridden prison cell. Women and children faced special dangers, both as victims and as suspects. Accused of petty theft, a young girl might be sent to a reform school, or even a women's prison. Women accused of prostitution or vagrancy found their reputations destroyed, their options for honest work closed off forever. Yet, for the rich, a youthful indiscretion might be quietly overlooked, handled privately to avoid scandal. Still, the city adapted. In working-class neighborhoods, networks of watchfulness developed, a kind of informal policing where neighbors looked out for one another, shared warnings, and sometimes intervened to prevent crimes or protect the vulnerable. Gossip was a weapon, but also a shield. News of a thief or a violent husband spread quickly, sometimes giving families time to act, to move, or to defend themselves. Children played a part in these networks, their eyes and ears everywhere. They learned to run for help, to remember faces, to sound the alarm if danger threatened. Parents, for all their fears, took comfort in knowing that the whole street would rise in defense if something went badly wrong. For those caught up in the justice system, life was harsh. Prisons were overcrowded, cold, and unsanitary. Inmates slept on straw or hard benches, their days marked by back-breaking labor and scant, tasteless food. Disease spread quickly, and the lines between criminal and simply unlucky blurred as men, women, and even children languished behind bars. Letters from home were treasures, stories of life outside the walls, a lifeline in the gloom. The psychological toll of crime and punishment left its own marks. Families who lost a father to prison or transportation struggled to survive, children forced to grow up too soon, mothers taking in extra work or relying on charity. The shame of a conviction could haunt a family for generations, closing doors to apprenticeships, marriages, and jobs. Yet, even here, small mercies appeared. A kind constable who overlooked a minor infraction, a judge who listened with compassion, a neighbor who vouched for a friend in trouble. These moments of grace reminded everyone that justice, imperfect as it was, could sometimes bend toward kindness. As the city grew and changed, so did the forms of crime and the methods of policing. New technologies, telegraphs, street lighting, better locks, offered hope, but also new ways for criminals to adapt. Gangs developed codes of loyalty and secrecy, some rising to the level of local legend, their exploits retold in pubs and markets. But the daily routines of caution, care, and community endured. Each morning, families checked their doors, counted their pennies, and hoped for an uneventful day. Each evening, the sound of the constable's boots brought reassurance, and sometimes a little dread. In this world, to survive meant more than hard work. It meant vigilance, adaptability, and the ability to forgive, to trust, and to rebuild after every loss. The fear of crime, like the fog, was everywhere, but so too was the light of human resilience, shining quietly through the gloom, keeping hope alive for a safer, kinder tomorrow. Childhood in Victorian England was, for most, a far cry from the images found in illustrated books or nostalgic tales. For the children of ordinary families, whether in crowded city tenements, smoky industrial towns, or modest country cottages, growing up was not a time of pure innocence or carefree play, but a period marked by responsibility, hardship, and a constant negotiation between duty and fleeting moments of joy. The first years of life were often uncertain, infant mortality was high, and many families suffered the heartbreak of losing a child before their first birthday. Babies were swaddled in hand-me-down cloths, rocked in cradles patched and mended, and tended by mothers or older siblings who themselves were barely out of childhood. Illness could sweep through a household in days, and every cough or fever brought fear and sleepless nights. For those who survived, life quickly became a blend of routine and expectation. By the time a child could walk and talk, they were already part of the family's daily work. Girls helped with washing, cleaning, and caring for younger brothers and sisters. Boys fetched water, ran errands, and sometimes followed their fathers into small trades or labor. Children learned early that every member of the household was needed, that there was little time for idleness. School was a possibility, but not a guarantee. Some children, especially in the city, attended basic dam schools, private homes where a local woman taught reading, writing, and sums for a small fee. Others went to charity or parish schools, their days filled with lessons, prayers, and discipline. For the poorest, even this modest education was often beyond reach. Work took priority, and any time away from earning was a luxury few could afford. Those who did attend school found it both a privilege and a challenge. Classrooms were crowded, benches hard, and teachers strict. Lessons were memorized by rote, and mistakes met with scoldings, sometimes even corporal punishment. Yet for many children, the classroom was a window to a wider world, a chance to learn about distant lands, to read stories, and to dream of a life beyond their neighborhood. Friendships formed quickly, as did rivalries, and the daily walk to and from school became a time of laughter, secrets, and the first stirrings of independence. Work was the constant shadow at the edge of every childhood. Boys as young as 5 or 6 delivered newspapers, swept streets, or worked as errand runners for local shops. In factories and mills, children were prized for their small size and nimble fingers. They crawled under machines to clear jams, carried heavy loads, and worked long hours for pennies a day. The dangers were real: cuts, burns, accidents, and the toll on growing bodies and minds was immense. For girls, the world of work was just as demanding, though often less visible. Many were sent into service, working as maids, nursemaids, or kitchen helpers in larger homes. Their days began before dawn and ended late at night, filled with chores, commands, and constant vigilance. Even those who stayed home took on the bulk of household labor, from scrubbing floors to minding babies. Yet, even in the face of so much responsibility, children found moments of joy and escape. Play was not absent, but woven into the cracks of daily life. In the city, children invented games in alleyways, hopscotch drawn in chalk, marbles traded and lost, skipping ropes whirring in the morning light. In the countryside, the fields and woods became playgrounds, hide and seek in tall grass, climbing trees or fishing with a bent pin and a bit of string. Festivals, holidays and Sundays brought special freedoms. A rare penny might buy a sweet from a corner shop, a toy from a street vendor, or a spot at the puppet theater. At Christmas and Easter, even the poorest families tried to provide a treat: a new doll, a bag of nuts, or a ribbon for a favorite dress. These small joys became treasured memories, stories retold as children grew, and the years passed. Family life for children was a blend of warmth and worry. Older siblings looked after the young, and parents did what they could to shield their children from the worst hardships. Yet, discipline was strict, and obedience expected. The family was a team, bound together by necessity, as much as love. Quarrels flared, but so did loyalty, and the bonds of brotherhood and sisterhood often lasted a lifetime. The wider world was not always kind. Children faced dangers in the streets, traffic, gangs, and at times the attention of unscrupulous adults. Illness, hunger, and the loss of a parent could quickly push a child from security into struggle. For orphans and the abandoned, life was especially hard. Workhouses, reform schools and charity institutions offered shelter, but often little affection or hope. Religion and morality shaped childhood, too. Church attendance was routine, and children were taught to fear God, respect elders, and know their place. Bible stories and hymns provided comfort, but also reminders of sin, duty, and the dangers of pride or disobedience. For some, faith was a source of strength. For others, it was just another set of rules to follow. Adolescence brought new challenges. Boys faced the pressure to contribute more, to apprentice in a trade, or to seek work far from home. Girls were taught to keep house, sew, and prepare for marriage or service. For a lucky few, education or a helping hand offered a path to something more, a scholarship, a place in a better household, or the chance to learn a skilled trade. In the end, the passage from childhood to adulthood was not marked by ceremony or clear boundaries, but by a slow, often difficult transition. Children became workers, helpers, mothers and fathers in their turn. Their dreams, shaped by hardship, hope, and the example of those before them, carried them forward, even as the challenges of Victorian life remained. Yet, for all its trials, childhood in this era was not without meaning or joy. The stories told by candlelight, the laughter shared in the street, the friendships that endured despite poverty or pain, these were the treasures that for many lasted far longer than any toy or treat. In every crowded room, on every noisy street, the voices of children reminded the world that, even in the hardest times, life could still surprise, delight, and endure. As the days and weeks passed in Victorian England, the life of a child unfolded in a patchwork of duty and brief, golden flashes of freedom. Routines ruled everything, binding the family and neighborhood together. For many children, each morning began not with ease, but with a gentle shake or a sharp word, a mother calling from the kitchen, a father's boots thudding on floorboards. Beds were made quickly, if beds existed at all, and the day's work began before the first rays of sunlight had crept through the smudged window panes. Breakfast, if there was one, might be a crust of bread, a bowl of porridge, or on better days, a little jam or cheese. Older children helped dress the younger ones, tied laces, buttoned up collars, and soothed babies crying in the cold. As soon as hands and faces were washed, sometimes with water carried in from the street or yard, everyone scattered to their chores. For city children, the street was both playground and workplace. The youngest carried messages or watched siblings. Older boys ran errands, swept workshops, or apprenticed to butchers, bakers or blacksmiths, learning skills they hoped might someday earn them more than just a few coins. Girls helped in shops, sorted laundry, or followed their mothers from house to house, learning the endless round of sweeping, scrubbing, and caring for others. The clatter of wooden clogs, the creak of delivery carts, and the sharp cries of market sellers formed the soundtrack of childhood. For those lucky enough to go to school, a new kind of day awaited, one ruled by bells, lessons, and discipline. Lessons were recited in chorus, slates filled with sums and spelling, and the fear of a teacher's cane or stern glance kept many children on their best behavior. Yet, school brought a different kind of fellowship. Children compared ink-stained fingers, swapped stories, and helped each other cheat on a sum or memorize a hymn. A scraped knee, or a new hat, became the subject of endless gossip. Playtime, though brief, was a sacred hour, jumping rope, racing down alleys, or simply huddling together for warmth and laughter before being herded back indoors. Seasons shaped the pace of childhood as much as any clock or calendar. In spring and summer, children played outside as long as light allowed. They caught tadpoles in muddy ponds, plucked wildflowers, and traced patterns in the dust with bare toes. Autumn brought games of conkers, treasure hunts in piles of leaves, and the last of the harvest apples. Winter was the harshest, with biting winds, short days, and the threat of illness always near. Yet, even then, children found joy, sliding on frozen puddles, listening for the sound of a new snowfall, or gathering around a single candle for stories and games. Friendships formed quickly in a world where every day brought new challenges. Neighbors' children became as close as siblings, bound together by secret signals, whispered plans, and shared mischief. They protected each other from bullies, pooled pennies for sweets, and mourned together when one of their own was sent away to work or fell ill. Rivalries flared and faded, but loyalty endured, strengthened by hardship and the unspoken knowledge that in the end, everyone was in the same boat. Home was not always a haven, but it was the center of life. Evenings meant chores, lessons, and, for the fortunate, a few moments of rest by the hearth. Mothers mended clothes or peeled potatoes, fathers repaired boots or counted the week's wages, and children finished homework by the flicker of a lamp. Stories told in whispers or sung in low voices became the thread that connected generations. Tales of brave children, clever animals, or far-off lands transported young listeners far from the cramped walls of home. Yet, sadness and worry were never far away. A cough in the night, a parent's worried glance, or the sudden absence of a friend reminded children that life could change quickly. The death of a pet, the loss of a job, or a harsh winter could send a family into crisis. Some children bore the burden quietly, comforting siblings or shouldering new responsibilities. Others rebelled in small ways, sneaking away for forbidden adventures, or whispering secrets to friends when the adults' backs were turned. Despite it all, children found ways to hope. Holidays brought excitement. Guy Fawkes Night, with its bonfires and sparklers, Christmas with its oranges, sweetmeats, and a new penny in a stocking, Easter with its painted eggs and the promise of spring. Even a single day's break from routine, a fair, a visit from relatives, a parade marching down the street, became a treasured story, retold again and again in the long months that followed. Adolescence arrived slowly, often marked by more work and higher expectations rather than by gifts or parties. Boys left home to apprentice or seek work. Girls took service, or began to help manage the household. Friendships were tested, sometimes lost, sometimes transformed into the bonds that would last a lifetime. The first taste of love, the excitement of new clothes, or the pride of learning a skill offered glimpses of a different future. Through every hardship, childhood in Victorian England was defined by resilience, a determination to find light in the shadows, to laugh in the face of adversity, and to hold on to small pleasures when the world seemed unforgiving. Every game played, every lesson learned, every secret kept was an act of quiet defiance against a life that often demanded too much too soon. As night settled over the city or village, children crawled into beds or makeshift nests, huddled for warmth, sharing dreams of adventure, comfort, or simply a better day tomorrow. The voices of parents faded into the gentle sounds of sleep, and in that hush, the true spirit of childhood endured, a mixture of strength, imagination, and the stubborn hope that tomorrow, somehow, would bring something new and good. Amidst all the routines and struggles of Victorian England, through the endless workdays, the cramped homes, the hunger, the worry about illness and danger, people still found ways to pursue rest, recreation, and even joy. The search for leisure was as much about survival as food or warmth. For many it meant carving out moments of pleasure in a world that offered few guarantees and many burdens. Leisure was above all a matter of opportunity and ingenuity. For the wealthy, leisure could mean travel abroad, afternoons at the theatre, and long holidays by the sea. But for most, it was snatched in short, precious bursts, a half hour at the end of a shift, a Sunday afternoon when the bells called everyone to rest, or a rare holiday when work could be put aside without fear of hunger the next day. Sundays were sacred in more ways than one. For working-class families, Sunday was the one day when the relentless pace of industry paused. Factories closed, shops shuttered, and even the poorest could count on a break, however brief, from their labors. Families dressed in their best, often the only nice clothes they owned, and made their way to church through bustling or muddy streets. The church was more than a place of worship, it was a community hub. A place to see friends, to sing, to mark the milestones of life, baptisms, weddings, funerals, the small and large transitions of every season. After church, there was time for simple pleasures. Families might stroll in a nearby park, if one was available, or gather with neighbors to share tea and stories. Children played in the streets, free from the week's chores, their laughter echoing between rows of houses. A penny saved during the week might be spent on a sweet treat, a favorite book borrowed from the lending library, or a ticket to a local fair or performance. Entertainment came in many forms, most of them humble. The theatre was popular, especially in the cities, with performances ranging from serious dramas to slapstick comedy, from the Shakespearean classics to the latest melodramas. Tickets for the gallery, the cheapest seats high above the stage, were sometimes affordable, even for the poor, who crowded in for an evening's escape from the greyness of everyday life. Travelling troupes brought puppet shows, circuses, and music to public squares and village greens, their arrival heralded by posters and word of mouth. Music was everywhere, a thread that wove through the hardest lives. In some homes a battered piano or fiddle might be the centerpiece of evening gatherings, while in others, songs were shared a cappella, handed down from generation to generation. Street musicians played for pennies in busy markets, their tunes brightening the air as shoppers paused to listen. Children danced, and a little money changed hands. Public houses rang with song at the end of a long week, the lyrics a mixture of nostalgia, hope, and the sly wit that helped people laugh at misfortune. Reading was another comfort. Even those who struggled to afford books found ways to borrow or share them, joining subscription libraries, trading with neighbors, or picking up cheap cereals and penny dreadfuls from the market. For many, the world of story provided a crucial escape, allowing them to imagine lives very different from their own, to dream of adventure, romance, or simply peace. Holidays and special occasions punctuated the year. Christmas brought greenery, candles, simple gifts, and for the lucky, a table spread with extra treats. Easter was marked with church services and the hope of warmer days ahead. Public fairs, processions, and national celebrations brought a sense of belonging, a reason for flags, bonfires, and just occasionally, a day without care. For women, leisure was often social, visiting with neighbors over tea, joining sewing circles or charity groups, or simply walking together through a park or along a canal. These gatherings were a source of gossip, support, and shared wisdom. For men, the pub was the traditional gathering place, a pint of ale, a game of cards, and talk of politics, work, or sports. Both found in their ways opportunities for laughter and the easing of burdens. Children's play was unstructured but vital. Street games, makeshift toys, and spontaneous contests filled the spare moments of the day. In the countryside, climbing trees, building dens, or hunting for frogs along a stream offered adventure and a sense of freedom. Even in the city, the smallest patch of open space could become a world of possibility. Rest, too, was hard-won. For most, sleep was interrupted by the demands of babies, the snores of relatives packed in the same room, or the sounds of the city that never truly slept. Still, moments of quiet could be found, a mother's lullaby, the hush after supper, the comfort of a shared blanket, or a soft word before sleep. There was comfort in ritual, the same meal served on the same day each week, the evening prayer, the familiar route to church or school. These repetitions provided structure and meaning in a world that so often threatened to spin out of control. The passing of seasons, marked by small changes, a new dress for spring, a ribbon for a daughter's hair, or a carefully mended coat for winter, became sources of quiet pride. For those who could afford a little more, excursions to the countryside or seaside offered a taste of freedom. Special savings were set aside for a single day away from smoke and noise, a train ride to Brighton or Blackpool, a picnic by a river, a walk in the hills. These days were rare, but remembered for years, stories retold to children and grandchildren in the hope that someday, such pleasures might be more common. Through all the difficulties, the search for comfort and pleasure was a kind of rebellion, a refusal to be beaten down, a statement that life, despite its hardships, could still contain beauty, laughter, and hope. Each song sung, each story shared, each moment of joy was an act of quiet courage and perseverance. As night fell and the day's labors faded, families gathered in whatever comfort they could find. The glow of a lamp, the warmth of a shared bed, the gentle rise and fall of breath in a crowded room, all became reminders that, in the end, people endured not just by working and worrying, but by dreaming, celebrating, and finding joy, even in the most unexpected places.